The fragile ceasefire in Gaza is under major pressure. Israel is accusing Hamas of breaching the truce. Israeli media are reporting that all aid deliveries into Gaza are being stopped until further notice. The Israeli military has also confirmed that it carried out dozens of strikes across the territory, saying it was responding to attacks by Hamas militants on Israeli troops. Hamas has denied any involvement in clashes with Israeli soldiers. Health officials in Gaza say at least 19 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, ranging from Rafah in the south to Jabalia in Gaza's north. We can speak to Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's a Middle East analyst and senior director of the Counter-Extremism Project in Berlin. Welcome back to DW. Now, this ceasefire deal is about a week old. Already, we're seeing both sides are accusing each other of violations. Is this par for the course, or do you think the ceasefire is collapsing?
Well, it was always clear that this is going to be a very difficult process. The strategy was to let all sides agree on the broad strokes and only agree on the details for the very first step, exchange hostages against prisoners, and then renegotiate and negotiate as you go along. That means that, of course, Hamas is now really trying to do its utmost to stay in power in Gaza, whatever will happen in the second and the third stage. So clashes and ceasefire violations from either side are some risk that had to be taken if there was a process that should have started. We've seen over the last 2 years processes negotiated in great detail that broke down or never came to fruition. So the new strategy was broad strokes, first stage in detail, and then renegotiate the rest of the details.
OK, given what you've just said, we're hearing now that Israel is suspending all aid deliveries into Gaza over its claims that Hamas violated the truce. What do you think this is going to have in the immediate short term?
Look, it was clear that from the exchange of the live hostages onwards, Hamas was trying to play games in this agreement, especially with the bodies of the dead hostages. It was credible that some of them may have been lost, but given that this was the biggest lever that Hamas had against Israel, it was from the start not believable that 20 out of the 28 hostages were difficult to find, and the last couple of days have proven that that actually wasn't really true because they kept on trickling out. 2, 4, and then again 4. So Hamas is playing games while at the same time is trying to eradicate its internal opposition by fighting clans, by fighting families, by fighting smaller militias to make sure that it is really truly the owned armed forces, except for the IDF in the Gaza Strip, so it can dominate any future administration in the Gaza Strip of whatever shape and form it may take. Now, the suspension of the aid delivery, if it's only short and temporary, is not going to have a major impact. There was quite a lot of aid that was flowing in the last couple of days, but if this suspension would be prolonged, we would again look at a potential shortage of food in the Gaza Strip.
I wanted to ask you about some of the conflicting information about today's strikes in Rafah. Israel says it launched retaliatory strikes on Hamas after the group attacked its troops, but Hamas says it wasn't them. How likely is that? Could it have indeed been other fighters?
This is very, very, very unlikely because everyone else at the moment gets attacked by Hamas. So I would assume if you are already a much, much smaller, less organized, less well-armed party in the Gaza Strip and you get attacked by Hamas, you just don't have the resources or the time or the reason to attack the IDF, which also fights Hamas. It is clear Hamas did attack the IDF because there are dead IDF soldiers to prove that that happened. So this is just an argument that Hamas makes to further its propaganda. Again, it tries to reverse who is the victim and who is the aggressor here.
How many groups, though, are operating inside Gaza, aside from Hamas? Can you give us a bit of a picture there?
Quite a few. There are a couple of short militias, clan-based militias, some of which were in the last couple of months supplied by Israel with weapons in order to build up a counterweight against Hamas, but they're not strong enough to actually withstand Hamas. And then, of course, there are a couple of criminal organizations that always operated in the Gaza Strip. The problem that Hamas has is that anyone with a weapon but Hamas means there could be a potential counterweight against it. That's why they have to physically eliminate and publicly execute all of its opponents right now to make sure that the Gazan population knows that there's only one power except for the Israeli army, that is Hamas. And if there ever is going to be a new administration in the Gaza Strip, that it understands who has the actual power if the Israeli army is not in the Strip.
OK. I wanted to ask you finally, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, they're expected to arrive in Israel on Monday to try and mediate the return of the remains of Israeli hostages. Given that it was US momentum that got the two sides to this point, can these two men, these two individuals, help turn the situation around?
Clearly on the Israeli side, they have a lot of leverage. There's not much leverage that they have on Hamas, but Qatar, Egypt, and particular Turkey, which holds to a certain extent also, together with Qatar, the purse strings of Hamas, do have influence on Hamas. So there needs to be a continuous process of negotiation for the next details that this process goes forward. It is not, maybe it was misunderstood, it wasn't the beginning of the process, it was the beginning of the second stage of negotiations that happened after the first exchange of hostages. And already in step 1.5, Hamas was trying to levitate, play games by not releasing all the bodies it clearly already had.
That was Hans-Jakob Schindler, Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. Thanks so much for your insights again, Hans-Jakob.
Thank you so much.
NTW correspondent Emily Gordine in Jerusalem has the latest.
So Israeli authorities say that militants fired a anti-tank missile and gunfire towards IDF troops that were operating in that area around the city, the southern city of Rafah. They were operating there to dismantle what they've called a terrorist infrastructure. In response to this incident, they have now begun striking that particular area to dismantle tunnel shafts and military structures, as they've put it. But a lot of question marks loom over this entire incident. It's not clear whether this militant group was Hamas or whether it wasn't. Could this have been militants that were still stuck in tunnels that were being dismantled, or was this a planned attack? That's really not clear at this point. Hamas, for its part, has said that it has nothing to do with this incident. It did say that they'd lost all contact with previous parts of the group that were operating in that area since the resumption of the war in March. And they've said that Israel is essentially using this as an excuse to resume the war again now. Now, the Israelis have called this a blatant violation of the deal that was signed between Israel and Hamas only about just over a week ago. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right national security minister, has called for the resumption of the war, which is not altogether surprising since he has been opposed to the ceasefire deal from the start. And now Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed that the IDF, that Israel will respond forcefully to this incident. We understand that in the next coming days, the US Vice President J.D. Vance, together with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, will be arriving in Israel to discuss these allegations made by Israel, but also to make sure that this deal does proceed. At this point, all we have is a ceasefire, and as we can see now, that is quite fragile. But this US administration seems adamant in pushing forward. Donald Trump himself has promised that his 20-point plan will bring eternal peace to the Middle East. But of course, this plan is very vague. A lot of it still has to be figured out between the two sides. And this incident, as we're seeing it now, shows just how shaky things still are in getting to the next phase of this deal.
Our correspondent Emily Gordine there in Jerusalem. Thank you, Emily.